Hey YouTube, it's me again. I've had a lot on my mind. Yesterday, I left a video about kind of stereotypes of small town America in the movie Three Billboards. Today, I wanted to talk about something completely different than that. How you can understand history. I think the development of history best, not necessarily by looking first at the popular ideology, but looking at more fundamental forces like demographics and things like who has control over the mechanisms of violence. I think you can understand the course of history, and even to a large degree where we are today, by understanding who has control over the mechanisms of violence. This is a lot more determinative in terms of the type of political structure you're going to have, I think, than anything. And I think history kind of bears that out, and I'll get to that in a minute. What prompted me to want to talk about this was I was listening to a history audio book the other day, and the professor he was finger waving at the age of heroes, the Bronze Age, the age of like Achilles and guys like that. He was really going to this kind of moral rant about it. It was like, this is, to celebrate warfare and death and all this type of stuff in the way that that people did during this period of time was wrong and immoral and all this other stuff. But there was so much wrong with that, I thought. I mean, up until recently, warfare was constant, and that seems to have been the case back through time indefinitely. An age of peace between where everybody shared everything. There's no evidence that it existed. There's no physical evidence anyway. I mean, if it did, we don't know about it. People kind of combating for land and cattle and resources. It's constant. It's everywhere. There's no part of the earth where you don't see evidence of this as far back as you can find anything in history. It's everywhere. It's all over the place. Morally condemning it from like a modern perspective is just like they were doing what we think that they should, but they didn't care about any of that. I mean, they had different periods of times have totally different values. But anyway, I mean, I think just as importantly, the reason why, for instance, that age came about in the midst of all this resource competition back then. I mean, people starved to death, so they were more than willing to think terrible things about their neighbor next door, pick up a sword and, live or die trying to get their stuff. That was just how the world worked. But bronze itself was really at the center of that age of heroes. You had, armies were basically like Stone Age armies. You had slingshots and clubs and things like, and then a few aristocrat warriors with metal weapons on chariots. That was the layout of the battlefield. And that battlefield formation, that style of fighting, lent itself to this aristocratic warrior class because they had weapons that were much better than anyone else's. They had, and bronze was fairly rare, so you could not fit a whole army with it. Then that age fell because iron weapons came into play. It was like having nuclear weapons available at the local grocery store. Iron was all over the place once they figured out how to smelt it. It was everywhere. It wasn't rare at all, and it was much harder, sharper than bronze. It was a superior metal. So suddenly you could outfit huge numbers of people with, and it just became like the Wild West for several hundred years. Then you had the Greek Classical Age, and there was this budding of like democratic stuff. Not democracy in the way that we know it, where every person had a vote, but broader representative governments. But the reason for that was the style of fighting that was so successful then. The phalanx formation. These guys that were just locked in. It wasn't an age of heroes. It was just this mass of guys. They went into it a little bit in the movie 300, like shield, spear, shield, spear. They'd amass together, just run their enemy over. And that would be the most powerful group of guys in the States, so they would kind of invariably work their way into the political system. It was a very democratic style of fighting that brought about, democracy, because phalanx formations beat non-phalanx formations. But in order to field one, you had to have kind of guys willing to do that. It was all the guys in the front would like die even if you won. It was a democratic style of fighting, or a style that lent itself to democracy. And then, once Rome came in and figured out how to beat that with kind of smart generalship and this checkerboard formation, just throwing huge spears into it, then it became more the age of like smart generals, because now fighting became a little bit more sophisticated. There was, kind of this checkerboard formation type stuff. Generals came to rule, like Caesar and all those guys, Marius and Sulla and Pompey. It was this age of military dynasts that led to the Republic. That's just great generals won then if they were smart. It was an age of strategic battling. Then you move into the moved into the feudal age. Things got that way because fielding the knights in shining armor alongside kind of this peasant mob, not too dissimilar to what existed in the Bronze Age, this kind of Age of Heroes, other than the fact that formations of knights with lances is what kind of kept the peace, because they could just smash apart any mob. I mean, that was the best style of fighting on the battlefield. Those were the most effective militarily, based on available military technology. That type of political structure where you could kind of, the lord in his castle could marshal his forces quickly and produce something. I mean, peasants, if they wanted democracy, then there wasn't much they could do. They'd get mowed down by these guys, with massive amounts of armor and deadly jousts. Well, they just had pitchforks. So it was the mechanisms of violence that kind of kept things that way. Then once cannon was introduced, these kind of lords, autocrats in their castles, that became obsolete because kings could now control their aristocracy. They could just line up cannon and blast down their castles, and that led to the age of like the Louis XIV, the King Henry VIII, Charles V, these kind of absolutist monarchs. But then suddenly, once rifles came into the equation, now you could feel these kind of big armies. A peasant with good aim was worth 5 knights in shining armor. The knights in shining armor was done, but what went out with that was eventually the political structure that was based on, and now you had democracy, just because the most deadly weapons, the most deadly means of violence were very broadly available. I mean, pretty soon everybody had a rifle. They had a rifle to go hunt, and then that made them basically ready-made soldiers. So it was that's what brought about them. And now, you could apply this to the current era, consider the mechanisms of violence and how those are leading to successful or less successful political structures. And, the conclusions that you might come to with that they don't always feel real good. For instance, democracy does not have a very good history of like keeping the peace. It has a history of like warfare and vengeance all throughout history. It's not when you try to think about it and rationally apply it to history, you may not come to the conclusions about good order and governance that John Locke or Rousseau would want you to have. But anyway, I think that understanding those mechanisms of violence, how they were controlled, what the technology was, who had access to them, that lent itself, first to the political system and also to the popular culture. Like all the celebration in the Age of Heroes about these, warrior aristocrats. Ramses the Great, probably the most famous pharaoh in Egypt, he made his whole career out of being an aristocrat warrior as a young man. Like that was his forever image that allowed him to just become this kind of living god later on in life. But yeah, so like the mechanisms of violence determine so much. If you really want to think about it, it's not always the nicest way to look at history, but I think it'll tell you more.